This will sound very strange, but Donald Trump's famous golden escalator ride in Trump Tower in June of 2015, the symbolic event that began the Trump presidential era and the countless Trump prophetic signs, was a major prophetic event that is predicting that President Trump will die from a heart attack on August 23rd, 2022. It will be the last Trump sign, a massive prophetic sign that is warning that God's judgment is about to befall the nation. It will also signal that the resurrection rapture event will be on the Feast of Trumpets on September 26th, 2022. Trump's death from a heart attack will symbolize the State of the Union and America's spiritual condition, which is heart disease towards God. Besides what I am about to explain, the proof that these predictions were made ahead of time is the date that YouTube says this video was posted, and videos can't be edited once they are posted. Additionally, what documents that these predictions were made ahead of time are these emails that are timestamped by Google, as well as these PDF documents that were created by a company named Forensic Notes. If you are skeptical, email me and I will forward these to you. People have their worldviews, and so people will tell themselves in their own mind how and why I was able to know these predictions in advance. However, I assure you that your assumptions are not correct. I have spent the last 5 years working from morning until night learning about God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections. I assure you that I know better than you the reasons for how and why God has given me a voice through these predictions. In the description box below this video, I will leave a link to a video titled God's Purpose for These Predictions. The current 4-minute video that you are watching is only the introduction to the video titled God's Purpose for These Predictions. The full video is 17 minutes, and the link to the full video will be in the description box below this video. The full video is on a different channel than the channel that you are currently watching this video on. It would be an enormous shame for you to learn about these predictions, but not know the reasons for how and why God has given these predictions. In other words, unless you watch this video, God's Purpose for These Predictions, you will have missed the point of this video and the point of this video channel. Make sure you watch the video, God's Purpose for These Predictions, either before or after watching this video. All right, so what you are looking at in this diagram here, a lot or some of it has been explained, but this diagram demonstrates for us some of the most important parts of God's big picture of trails and patterns and signs and connections, especially when it comes to Trump. And so I'm just going to explain this diagram really quickly here to end this video. But again, it is exactly 50 weeks, and 50 weeks symbolizes the church, as Pentecost symbolizes the church, and Pentecost literally means 50th day, and also Pentecost is known as the Feast of Weeks. Hence why God uses 50 weeks connections in connecting and conjunction with judgment for the church prophetic signs, which is definitely the case for President Trump and his death, as I am explaining here. The death of Trump is symbolism for the trumpets that were blown before the walls of security collapsed on the ancient city of Jericho. And the main theme of God's big picture of signs, patterns, and connections is judgment warning for the church. Because as Peter said, judgment begins with the church. And the very reason, the primary reason for the end times period is to test the faith of these Christians that are in the church of Laodicea and the other churches that will not make the rapture. I'm speaking about the 7 churches that Jesus wrote letters to, which are symbolism for different aspects of Christians today. And also the church of Laodicea symbolizes the last church of the 7 churches, symbolizes the last church phase In other words, there are many people, including myself, that believe that the 7 letters to the churches are symbolism for the 7 stages of church history, and the last church, the Church of Laodicea, would be symbolizing today's evangelical church, the modern evangelical church. So, back from 50 weeks exactly, which is extremely prophetic judgment warning for the church, it is the Feast of Trumpets in 2021. And again, this was the day of the theft of the grapes in the vineyard. The vineyard symbolizes Jesus and God's church, who are of the vine, as Jesus said. And this was the day of the 7.0 magnitude earthquake, which is also Trump and Joshua symbolism. Again, because earthquakes just outside of the border wall of security in Mexico symbolize the earthquake that brought down the walls of the ancient city of Jericho. Again, this was the day of the other Latin American sign. This was also the day of the Supreme Court of Mexico ruling in favor of abortion being legal. And again, 1 person died due to a collapsed utility pole. The collapsed utility pole was symbolism for the collapsed walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho. And again, the reason why it is 7.0 is because this hints at the 7 priests that blew 7 trumpets after they marched around Jericho 7 times. And this also, by the way, parallels and is a confirmation of this 7-point earthquake, which I'll mention in a minute. It was 1 death because it was hinting at the 1 death president of Trump. This isn't the only 1 death prophetic sign that has been used by God to point to the death of President Trump. And when I say again, when I'm explaining these again, is because these were explained in the absolute must-watch prediction, hockey heart attack predicts President Trump will die August 23rd. One of my personal favorites videos and a most astounding, important video. Make sure you watch that video. This was also the day that El Salvador, a country that has the exact same territory size as the country of Israel, El Salvador is Spanish for the Savior. This was the day that they made Bitcoin legal tender, and there will be an elimination of cash, and it will all be digital with the Antichrist system, which will enforce the mark of the Antichrist. This is why on this day, Bitcoin crashed $9,000, which was a huge thing at the time. And 9 is the most important number in God's big picture of signs. It symbolizes judgment from God. That's why this is all judgment on the church symbolism, an amazing exact 50 weeks before the day that Trump will die, which in other words will be a massive judgment warning sign for the American church, that it is on life support, it is spiritually dead. Okay, again, this was 666 days after the Dow closed unchanged to within 6 decimal places, which is unheard of. And again, this was the 3rd time in history that the Dow closed unchanged since the decimalization of the Dow. And the first time that that happened was 101 days after 9/11. And again, as was explained, this sign here was pointing to 9/11, and 11/11, the date 11/11 is symbolism for the 11th hour of the 11th hour, the very, very last chance. Time is running out to repent. And also, this was the day that Mercury traversed the sun, because after Trump's death and the Feast of Trumpets in 2022 will be the catastrophic solar storm coronal mass ejection hits from the sun. And also, and Mercury is the planet that is symbolism for the messenger, God's messenger. Also, this was the day of the meteor, the 220-pound meteor that flew over the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And in the Bible, judgment symbolically begins at the gates, and the meteor traversed the exact path of the totality of the American eclipse in 2017. This was exactly 50 months, and this confirms the 50 weeks, and that's how God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections works. It works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter, and that's what makes it true and not a product of one's imagination, and different and unique than everything else on the internet. And so 50 months is also symbolism for the church, and this was exactly 50 months after the 9/11 and 2015 sign, which was the crane Mecca disaster that killed 111 people. And it was the terrorists on 9/11 that came from this part of the world, the spiritual enemy, in capital being Mecca. Well, as was explained, 188 is symbolism for the 188th word in Strong's Hebrew Concordance, which is the word woe, ! Used in context of extreme judgment from God, and including in the book of Revelation. And it is exactly 188 weeks to this Feast of Trumpets, which is pointing to Trump and the last trump on the Feast of Trumpets in 2022. Because that's what the death of Trump is too. It's also the last trump symbolism, as Paul said that the rapture would occur in conjunction with the last trump. In archaic English, the word trump is trumpet, means trumpet. And it is exactly 188 weeks. This is astounding. It is exactly 188 weeks back from this Feast of Trumpets, which connects to the death of President Trump, to Trump's State of the Union speech. This was the night of the super blue blood moon. And God has associated prophetic moons with Trump. Trump was born on the day of a prophetic lunar eclipse blood moon, for example. This super blue blood moon is hinting at the blue face that is a result of a heart attack. This was hinting at a heart attack for President Trump, which will symbolize the State of the Union, which is heart disease towards God. This is an amazing connection. It's a simple 188 weeks and then 50 weeks to the death of Trump from the super blue blood moon. Super because it was the closest, it was extremely closest in that year or something, the moon. And it was a blood moon at that. And it was a blue moon because it was 2 in 1 month. So it was a super blue blood moon, which hinted at the blue face from a loss of blood in the face. People that have heart attacks suffer a lack of blood and a blue face. All right, now, it is exactly 2 years and 22 days to this prophetic earthquake. And, well, trumpets were blown at Jericho before the walls of security collapsed due to an earthquake. Archaeology proves that the walls of Jericho collapsed due to an earthquake. Furthermore, when asked by his disciples for the signs to look for of his return, Jesus mentioned earthquake signs. This is an extremely prophetic earthquake. I'll explain in a second, but 2 years and 22 days is symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist, which will be used to persecute the church. The primary purpose of the end times period is to test the faith of God's people through the Antichrist and the mark of the Antichrist, which will be very inconvenient to not take, but taking it will be tantamount to denying Jesus. And it is the snake bite, and it is not a supposed precursor to the mark of the Antichrist. Well, the reason why series of 2 symbolizes this is because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist, which was the Tav mark described in Ezekiel chapter 9, the Tav is the last and 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the mark of the Antichrist is described in the last book of the Bible, which is the 22nd of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. Also, the very first day of COVID was when Trump announced that there were 22 cases. He announced this at 2 p.m., and these 22 cases were in King County in Washington State, all president symbolism. Furthermore, Washington was born on the date 2/22, and God uses this also to symbolize Washington. And God does that as well, by the way. He combines symbolism. You need an abstract mind to appreciate and understand God's signs. He does do that. He does overlap symbolism all the time. Okay, so anyway, so that's why this 2 years and 22 months. Also, I forgot to clarify that this theft in the middle of the night, which is rapture symbolism, pointing to the parable of the bridesmaids, the call at the midnight hour. This theft of the vineyard, this was in Liberty, Missouri, which confirms more of this rapture symbolism. And I also want to point out, because I forget to later in a minute, but this earthquake is connecting with this earthquake, which connects with this earthquake. And that's just more confirmation. As I said, God's big picture of signs works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter. Also, what I forgot to mention in a second is that this Hutchinson, Kansas earthquake was one of 3 that were 4.0 or greater. There were only 3. And as I will explain in a minute, all 3 were prophetic. Also, the series of twos is symbolism for the second coming. And God's faithful will be raptured at his second coming on the Feast of Trumpets, the first of the 3 autumn feasts that will be fulfilled with the second coming. Also, one thing too is that when Trump announced at 2 p.m. 22 cases, it was also the time of the first announced death, the first official death. This was on February 29th, which was the leap year day in 2020. Well, the one death is one of these one death signs that are ultimately pointing to the death of President Trump. But that's explained in other videos. But since we have just mentioned that Trump is associated with the prophetic moons, or rather God associates prophetic moons with Trump, it is prophetic signs, and we just covered one amazing example of that, which was the super blue blood moon on the night of his first State of the Union speech, which pretty much culminated his first prophetic year, which was the prophetic year of his presidency. That's another story. The reason why the first official death from COVID was on the leap year day is because it was the 29th of the month. And it's a special day because there's only once every 4 years is there a 29th day of the month of February. The number 29 God uses as symbolism for the moon because the moon has 29 and a half days in its cycle. And so that's another reason why we know that this sign, the sign of that death, was ultimately pointing to the death of President Trump. And it is exactly, well, okay, this was the first of 3 prophetic earthquakes in Hutchinson, Kansas that occurred. 2 of them were in August 2019, and the other one was in January of 2020. The one in January of 2020 occurred on the same day as the Kansas City Chiefs won the AFC Championship in Kansas City to make it to their first Super Bowl in literally 50 years, symbolism for the church. And it is explained many other times, so I won't explain it again, how the Kansas City Chiefs symbolize the church. And the other earthquake, the second one, was 2 days after this. This one and the second one were 11 and 9 days before August 27th in 2019, which was the end of an amazing, most profound trail of signs that were at 9-day intervals that had earthquakes in them. It began with the Pentecost earthquake in Jericho, Washington State, followed 9 days later by the 0.9 earthquake in Queens, New York, where Trump was born, followed 9 days after that by the July 4th earthquake in Ridgecrest, California, the strongest in 20 years, as the media reported, which was literally 20 biblical years, which is 360-day calendar years, after this earthquake. And little did they know that it was an exact 20 years when they were saying it was the strongest in 20 years. But that was a July 4th earthquake, and the sign in that was the wall that collapsed behind the children that were performing a play in their school, and the wall had an American flag on it, and that's explained in other videos. But that was followed 9 days later by the earthquake in Manhattan, Montana, on the same day as the Manhattan blackout. And, anyway, on and on. Well, that was followed 9 days later by the earthquake in Joshua Tree National Park on the same day that the bison threw the 9-year-old girl up in the air. In Yellowstone National Park, right next to Old Faithful Geyser, and all of that was pointing to the upcoming eruption of Yellowstone on September 24th, 2022. Anyway, that's explained in other videos too. The point is that the other earthquake here was at the end of this. August 27th was 9 days and 11 days after these 2 Hutchinson, Kansas earthquakes, and on that day was the end of the trail of signs. In other words, all of that trail of signs was pointing ultimately to this, August 27th, and this was the day of the massive church roof fire in Philadelphia. And God uses Philadelphia to symbolize the church. One of the 7 churches was written to the Church of Philadelphia, and it's juxtaposed with the other churches, including the signs pointing to Church of Laodicea, because Jesus said that the Church of Philadelphia would be the only church that would be raptured. And that's why also on that same day was the first day of the installation of the first ever anywhere in history dynamic scoreboard in the arena where the Flyers play. The Philadelphia Flyers, and the rapture people will fly. And it was pyrotechnics. Fire symbolizes the church, Pentecost, which symbolizes the church. And that's because fire came down on Mount Sinai. And in the first Pentecost, it was tongues of fire that came down on the disciples in the upper room. Well, the scoreboard is lifted up into the roof of the arena. It's hidden in the roof of the arena during concerts. And that's symbolism for the hidden of those that will be raptured, God's faithful. The vast majority will be left behind, however, the vast majority of people that call themselves Christians. By the way, I'm just going through this. I can't remember all of the details, right? I can't remember every single detail, but also the thing is that pyrotechnic scoreboard, which had some 50s in it, I'm trying to remember, but it being lifted up into the rafters and hidden in the rafters is why the massive church roof fire, and this isn't the only church roof destruction sign that's symbolism for the church, and it's because of Pentecost when tongues of fire came down on the disciples in the upper room. That's why church roof fires and other church roof signs, including, for example, the Notre Dame church roof fire that everyone's familiar with, which was a 9-hour fire, because 9 is the number that from the Bible that symbolizes God's judgment, and was judgment warning for the church. And so and it was a national news story, this church roof fire in Philadelphia. It was a huge fire. It was a historic church. But even though it was a historic church, it had been used at the time, it was being used by an evangelical church. But anyway, that was all that on August 27th. That's why Hutchinson, Kansas. Now, why Hutchinson, Kansas is because God is pointing to Anne Hutchinson, the leader of the Free Grace movement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the leader of the Free Grace controversy, actually. It's called the Free Grace controversy. It's also called the antinomian controversy. Antinomian is Latin for anti-law. And the Free Grace movement, she was banned for this and then was murdered by Native Indians. The Free Grace movement is the doctrine that the vast majority of Christians follow today. And make sure you watch the 23 church signs video on this channel. Doctrine is extremely important. It isn't something that isn't important. It's extremely important. And I know people today, because of this doctrine, think that it isn't important because, well, I don't need knowledge. I just love God. The Bible never separates knowledge of God from knowledge for God. The two are combined. Our knowledge of God deepens our love for God. It is extremely important, and most people have this free grace doctrine, and Jesus said in the book of Revelation that he is coming to make war with the sword of his mouth on those that teach and have the works that are a product of this doctrine. This is why the Church of Laodicea is the vast majority of evangelical Christians today. Those that think they don't need anything, they're saved by faith alone. The only place that phrase occurs is in James chapter 2, when James says, you see, for a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. People are deceived by Satan. This is Gnostic doctrine, and this is why the church is lazy and is shining its lights within its church, and why it says things like politics are idolatry. You know, they don't even need to learn about what's going on in the world today. They have lost their saltiness, and when Jesus said when they have lost their saltiness, they are no longer good for anything except to be trampled under the feet of men, which is why the end times period is beginning now. It's because of this Nicolaitan doctrine, the doctrine that Jesus says he hates and is coming to make war with, which is why God is using Anne Hutchinson, okay? And so I've explained it a little bit. I explain it better in other videos, and also make sure you watch the 23 church signs video. I know a lot of people listening to what I have just said are squirming in their seats, but they have the Gnostic doctrine, and John called these people in his letters antichrists, because the Gnostics were trying to infiltrate the church, and Augustine corrupted the church in the 5th century. Augustine was a Gnostic auditor, an official one in the Manichaean sect for 9 years before he joined the Catholic Church, and then later in his life corrupted the church with his writings, which were passed down to Calvin and Luther. Calvin titled his writings Systematic Augustinianism. Luther was an Augustinian monk, and that's why Luther wanted to take the book of Revelation, the book of James, and the book of Hebrew, for example, out of the Bible. All right, now this is exactly 50 months, which is again symbolism for the church, to the day it all began, the symbolic beginning of Trump signs. The grand entrance of Trump, and in his tower, which is also prophetic. Towers in the Bible symbolize judgment, are in context of judgment. And this is the day he descended the golden escalator and entered politics on this June 16th date in 2015, exactly 50 months before this earthquake. And what confirms the prophetic relevance of this, my friends, is this. Exactly 188 months after this extremely prophetic earthquake, and this would only be scratching the surface of the connections to this Joshua Tree earthquake, the 7.0 earthquake, this 7.0 earthquake in Joshua Tree, California. Well, the town Joshua Tree, which is next to Joshua Tree National Park. And it was 7.0, which is extremely prophetic. And, well, when the trumpets were blown at Jericho, they marched around Jericho 7 times while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. That's why this 7.0 magnitude earthquake at Joshua Tree. And 188 is whoa exclamation mark. And Trump was God's trumpet that trumpeted that judgment is about to begin on America. That is, in essence, what Trump's presidency was all about. That's, for example, why it was all about and synonymous with his border wall of security, which symbolized the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho when trumpets were blown, and then they collapsed in God's judgment. Also, I forgot to mention that on this Feast of Trumpets, there was a sign in the Tao, which is confirmation of this connection of 666 days to the day that the Tao changed unchanged to within 6 decimal places. And by the way, in conjunction with that was Trump's kickoff to his election campaign, which was when he delivered an economic speech at the New York Economic Club in Lower Manhattan, and that's where the Dow New York Stock Exchange is. And so that was in conjunction with the day that the Dow closed unchanged. Well, anyway, 666 days later, we get another Dow stock market sign, which was when the Dow closed at 35,100.00 points. The odds of the Dow closing at an even number is 1 in 100, but it being a meaningful number is astronomical, of course. And so it's hinting at the number 351, 35,100.00. That's 4 zeros in a row. So you can calculate the odds on that. That's obviously a lot more than 1 in 100. That's 1 in 10,000. Okay, so that's pointing to 351, which in Strong's which is in Strong's Greek New Testament concordance. The word for judicial examination, investigation, in other words, judgment. But judgment on the church. Judicial examination and investigation of the church, which is why it occurred on the Feast of Trumpets, on the day that the grapes were stolen from the vineyard in Liberty, Missouri. And by the way, I forgot to mention, the vineyard was owned by a church. I can't believe I forgot to mention that. The vineyard was owned by a church. The grapes were grown for their communion. It was a church vineyard. And it was in Liberty, Missouri. And it was in conjunction with these other prophetic signs as well, as I explained. And so judicial examination, investigation of the church. 50 weeks later, the death of President Trump.